All right, so we're back and we're going to talk next about the main structures of the brain. You may have heard the brain sort of categorized into different groupings based on different words. In our textbook and in cognitive psychology, they tend to focus on the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. The hindbrain, you might have learned that it's called the brainstem, and in this case, that's a perfectly fine exchange. They are virtually identical. The hindbrain and the brainstem are almost identical. Then there's the midbrain that doesn't really have an equivalent in, like when I teach introductory psychology, I call the brainstem the brainstem. I don't talk about the midbrain at all. And then in the forebrain, there's the limbic system, and then there's the cerebral cortex, or what you might have heard called the cerebrum. I skip the midbrain entirely when I teach introductory psych, and I just talk about the brainstem, the limbic system, and the cerebral cortex. So you might have encountered it that way too. There unfortunately are different names for, for the same exact things, and it can be super confusing as you're learning them. But in this book, in this context, we're going to call them the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain, and then we'll break down the forebrain into the two parts that you might be more familiar with, the limbic system and the cerebral cortex. All right, well, that's enough excuse making. Let's get to work. All right, so let's start with the hindbrain slash brainstem. It's basically the top of the spinal cord, right? You've got the spinal cord coming up from the spinal column, and you've got this little bit of a swelling, and then you got a bigger swelling on it, and then you've got the little brain in the back. This area of the brain is really in charge of very basic life functions. Like if you have damage to your brainstem, you're probably going to have either significant impairment or possibly not be able to survive given that damage. So let's start with the cerebellum. This is one where you probably can survive, but you're going to have significant impacts. The cerebellum is that back part, and cerebellum actually means like little brain because it kind of looks like a smaller version of the rest of the brain, doesn't it? It's kind of got those same convolutions. It's actually got two hemispheres, just like the larger part does. It's very similar. It handles very basic things like movement. Things that you usually do without thinking about would be controlled by the cerebellum. That would include any kind of movements that you would do without thinking about. Balance. You don't usually think about your balance, but so it's one of those things that can happen without any conscious awareness. Normally, the cerebellum just takes care of that. And then basic learning things like association learning is going to happen in the cerebellum, just basic stuff. The pons, if you sweep my little red mark over there, you see the pons is that big swollen part at the top of the spinal cord, and it's in charge of your sleep-wake cycle. It's what makes you feel drowsy, so what makes you feel alert. It handles those kinds of things. The medulla, which is the just below the pons, it's the first real swelling coming out of the spinal cord, and it's in control of heart rate and breathing. And if you have damage to the medulla, this is the area where it's like you may not make it. If it's heartbeat, you're not going to make it. If it's breathing, you might be like Christopher Reeves, who injured himself going over the head of his horse and broke his very top cervical vertebra, and it damaged his medulla. Initially, he didn't have heart rate or respiration, but he did get his heart rate back. He never got involuntary respiration back. He could breathe on with very exquisite effort. He could tell himself breathe in, breathe out. Like he could do it, but he could never sleep without his ventilator, because you need that area of the medulla to make you sleep, breathe even when you're sleeping. Had it been his heartbeat and it never came back, there's no machinery that would have kept him alive. So that medulla is super critical, very basic stuff. Now let's move up a little bit to the midbrain, and you'll notice this line is just sort of pointing at that top of the pons. It's also part of the structures that are in that brown area above that. Just sort of all these indistinct things that are sort of in that center of that cavity in the middle of the brain. There are areas of that are responsible for coordinating very precise eye movement. The the cerebellum is in part in charge of the eye movements, but that little structure that goes down to the cerebellum is really critical for precise eye movement. Relaying auditory information from the ears to the forebrain. Now, that's something that happens in these connections inside that what looks like a cavity, but the lining of that cavity has all these structures. And then regulating pain experiences, regulating, your awareness of pain or not pain is happening there in that midbrain area. Now, the forebrain, if we talk about the limbic system component of that, we are talking about that purple ball, the top area of above the pons is the thalamus. You have this structure that's sort of on the top of the brainstem, and that's the thalamus. And it's really your sensory relay station. So as information comes in through your eyes, it lands in the thalamus first and then goes back to the back of your brain for visual processing. As stuff comes in from your ears, it goes through part of the midbrain, but then lands in the thalamus and then gets sent to the proper place for on the temporal lobes for processing. And touch, same thing, goes up to the sensory strip for touch, and so on. So it's your sensory relay station where all incoming information lands in the thalamus first and then gets sent on for further processing. The hypothalamus is on the bottom of the thalamus. Hypo means below, thalamus, right? So below the thalamus, and so it's a small structure on the bottom. You can see it pointing at like that green area that's on the bottom of the purple thalamus. If only the structures were really colorized, it would be a lot easier when you have to do your brain dissection, but unfortunately they're not. The hypothalamus, below the thalamus, is in charge of regulating your hormones, and it governs a lot of your motivations to eat, your motivations for drink, your motivation for sex. These kinds of things are regulated by your hypothalamus. And then what we would call strictly the limbic system would be made up of structures like the amygdala. You'll notice it's also green in this picture. And you actually have an amygdala on the other side of the brain. You're only seeing one side right now. So there's amygdala and hippocampus on the other side as well. The amygdala handles emotional processing, and just basic ones like fear and anger in particular are handled by the amygdala. And then the other part that we've got highlighted here would be the hippocampus, and it is crucial for learning and memory. It's where information lands first that's going to be ultimately stored if you use it enough and do some other things to convince your brain to store it permanently. So it's sort of your temporary storehouse of information. It also has been implicated in sort of your awareness of your current circumstances. People who have disruptions of that, people, for example, with schizophrenia or other kinds of hallucinatory kinds of effects, tend to have damage in their hippocampus. So the hippocampus seems to be where you sort of bring together all the things that make up your current awareness. All right, now let's get to the cerebral cortex. Still in the forebrain, according to this categorization. The cerebral cortex surrounds the midbrain and most of the hindbrain. You'll notice that the cerebellum is still visible. You can kind of see the pons. So it's not perfectly surrounding the hindbrain, but it covers most of the other things we've been talking about. So there are 4 lobes present in your cerebral cortex. There's the frontal lobe, conveniently named because it's in front. There's the parietal lobe, which is basically on the top of your head towards the back. There is the occipital lobe, which is in the very back of your brain. And then you've got the temporal lobe. And we're looking at this person's left side of their brain. All of these are on the right side too. So you have 2 temporal lobes, 2 parietal lobes, 2 occipital lobes, 2 frontal lobes. So you have 4 lobes, but they're duplicated on each side of the brain. The cerebral cortex is what we call the outer surface of the forebrain, and this stuff that you can see, these convoluted areas that are, what we call the cerebral cortex, makes up about 80% of the brain. If we removed your cerebral cortex, all you'd be left with would be those midbrain brainstem structures, and that's not it doesn't have much volume. You have a lot of volume in your cerebral cortex. As I've already kind of been alluding to, your cerebral cortex is divided into 2 lobes, and you can see this longitudinal fissure that goes down the middle here. It goes down to the layer of the midbrain, and that's it. Like there's no separation in the midbrain. It's just the cerebral cortex that has this longitudinal fissure dividing the cerebral cortex into these two hemispheres. So I kind of want to go through those parts of the cerebral cortex that have really well dedicated structures, that have a really strongly genetically determined function. So in the brain that you're looking at the bottom there, you've got the green, what we call sulcus. These grooves on the brain, I don't know if you guys can see my arrow, I hope you can. These, I don't know if this is called a groove. These, you've got these grooves and then these bulges, right? So this is called a sulcus, right? This part that's sort of all together. This sulcus that's been colored green is your motor sulcus, and the one that's been painted blue is your sensory sulcus. What they've done is they've created these what we call homunculus, these human like descriptions of how the neurons in your brain are dedicated to processing information from different parts of your body or to different parts of your body. So in the primary motor area, you can see that the lips are very large compared to, let's say, your trunk. That would be your entire torso right here versus your lips. What this is implying with this diagram is that you have a lot more control over your lips than you do over your trunk. That makes sense, right? You do have more control over your lips than you do over your trunk or over your tongue, right? If you look at the tongue down here, way bigger than, let's say, your foot, right? Because in reality, your tongue is not as big as your foot. But you have a lot more control over your tongue than you have over your foot. There are things you can do with your foot, but I mean, it's not like a tongue. Let's be honest. Where over here you have your sensory strip, which is the motor area is in your frontal lobe and the sensory area is in your parietal lobe. They're directly across from each other though, and they look very similar, right? You have more neurons devoted to processing information coming in from some parts of your body than you have dedicated to processing information from other parts of your body. So you'll notice in this picture they've drawn male genitals, but they've drawn them relatively large compared to other structures. I mean, let's look at the entire leg versus how big this genitals area is drawn. That's because there are more neurons devoted to processing information coming up from the genitals than there are devoted to your entire leg. And same thing, look how big the thumb is, right? You have a lot of sensation, a lot of motor control over your fingers and your thumbs. Very big lips, very big tongue, right? Like these are indicating that there are certain parts of your body that you have a lot of neurons dedicated to processing that information, and certain parts of your body that are not. So your motor areas, as my header tells you, are in the frontal lobes. Your sensory areas, the incoming information, the touch sensation is in your parietal lobe, right, as I showed you on the last slide. But then I want to add in the visual cortex is in your occipital lobe. So the information coming in from your eyes will go back to your visual cortex. The information coming in from your ears will go to your auditory cortex. And there's auditory cortex on either side of your head. And I'll just give you the first little hint of what we call contralateral processing. The information coming in from your right ear gets processed on the left auditory cortex, and the information coming from your left gets processed on your right auditory cortex. Similarly, information coming from your right hand will be processed in the left hemisphere of your brain. Information going to your right hand will be sent from the left side of your brain, and vice versa. Everything is crisscrossed, and it's likely due to the fact that everything lands in the thalamus first, and it's sort of like the shortest distance between two things would be a straight line. So if information comes into, maybe I should go back here to the thalamus again just real quick. There you are. If the information comes into the thalamus, it is quicker to send it on a straight line trajectory onto the other hemisphere than it would be to send it on a V-shaped transmission onto the same side, right? You'd have to like bend it and send it back. So the straight line, so you've got information coming in from your left ear, it lands in the thalamus, might as well keep sending it across and have it land in the right hemisphere, right? So it more than likely is an efficiency thing, right? Like the shortest distance between two lines is a straight, between two objects is a straight line. All right, so these are the areas where all the sensory processing happens. Well, not all of them, right? Because you know that there are five senses and only three of them are shown on this picture. Here what we're seeing is touch, vision, and what we call audition or hearing. But what's missing is smell and taste. And smell and taste are handled more in the midbrain and then projected up more as memories to the cortex. And there's not a necessarily specific area of the cortex devoted to that. So what I'm showing you in this drawing right here, if you look just at that brain, it would be those parts of the cerebral cortex that have a very hardwired, genetically determined, unwavering structure. There are times when it's structured differently. There are times some people have brains that are organized a little bit differently. But for the vast majority of people, these structures, this is where they would appear. All right, so here we have on the right hand side two different views. We have what's called the lateral view on the left, which means we're looking at this brain from the left side where its ear would be, right? So the ear would be here facing us. Their nose would be facing to our left, right? So on the back of there, you can see the occipital lobe back here where the vision would land. So hopefully you can see my arrow as I say, okay, up here would be their eyes on the left side of the picture. Their ear would be here, their back of their head here. Now on the picture on the right, it's called a medial view because now they have cut down the middle of the brain, and so we're seeing the inside layer of that cerebral cortex. Now remember, the cerebral cortex didn't need to be cut, just the connecting tissue underneath it did. The cerebral cortex has that longitudinal fissure that keeps those two halves separate anyway. So what we're looking at is from the inside of the brain outward. And wherever it's blue, you are examining what is called association areas. On the diagram that I pulled off the internet, they're calling it association cortices, right? Because it's cortex. Multiple cortex would be called cortices. And you're looking at all the areas of the brain that don't have a natural, hardwired purpose. That's going to be about 75% of the cerebral cortex is what we call association area. They don't have a specific hardwired function, but we have started to narrow down sub areas within the association areas that seem to be super vital, and that if you have damage to these areas, you do see behavioral effects. Like, for example, there are certain areas that if they are damaged, you'll get what's called apraxia, which is problems with voluntary action. They'll have difficulty initiating movement or managing the movement in a smooth way. Agnosia would be problems identifying familiar objects, and we have identified certain locations in the brain where certain kinds of agnosia happen. There's what's called prosopagnosia, which is the inability to recognize human faces as human faces. There's a subtype of it where you can't recognize familiar face versus non-familiar face. That's a subtype of prosopagnosia. The general principle is that you have difficulty recognizing a human face from other kinds of objects. And there's a particular part of the brain that's devoted to that. If you have damage to the right temporal lobe, there's a very specific location in the right underside, sort of behind your ear, where damage to that area can make it impossible to recognize faces from other objects. There's other kinds of agnosia, though, by the way. There's agnosia for sound, where you may not be able to recognize a familiar sound from an unfamiliar sound. There's visual agnosias that have nothing to do with faces. There's lots of different kinds of agnosia, and they're all located in different parts of the association areas. Unilateral neglect syndrome is a type of disorder where the person really doesn't process part of their visual field, right? Like one side or the other of their the incoming information. They just ignore it. It's not, and not on purpose. For them, as far as they're concerned, it doesn't exist. And there are certain association areas that have been associated with this syndrome. And then aphasia is the blanket term that we use to describe problems with language, and it could be problems understanding language, it could be problems producing language, it could be problems recognizing written language versus other kinds of markings. There's different kinds of aphasia, and they are associated with different parts of the association areas. Always on the left hemisphere with these aphasias, but I wanted to mention that while we're arguing that association cortices really don't have any specific role, if that were completely true, then we wouldn't see these very specific damage effects, right? If it weren't the case that there's a specific part of your association area that's devoted to recognizing human faces, we wouldn't see prosopagnosia, right? So obviously these are not, it's not perfect that these association areas are all just free, open real estate to do whatever you want to with. But I do want to mention that what we are, so all those things that I just mentioned probably accumulate maybe up to maybe another 10% of cerebral cortex having maybe a distinct function. I'm going to stick the language areas in there and say maybe that's another 5% of our complete volume. And so I'm down to maybe 60%, 55, 60% of our brains being true association areas. This is super important because those association areas are available for us to store memories, to tailor our neural networks to our personal experiences, and so on. Right? So these are things that we need in order to support memory and learning and a lot of very normal developmental processes. All right, now I mentioned that the cerebral cortex is separated by that longitudinal fissure and that we have two hemispheres. So our brains display a lot of what's called lateralization, where one hemisphere tends to do certain kinds of things and the other hemisphere tends to do other kinds of things. So some things I've already mentioned are things like the contralateral switching of function. So the right hand is controlled and the sensory information is processed in the left hemisphere. Right hand, left hemisphere, right? Left hand, right hemisphere. So switching of the hands, okay. Pretty much everything switches, feet, legs, everything is contralateral, except for your eyes. Eyes are the one thing that are not completely contralateral. To simplify this, what you want to think about is that it's not that your eyes switch sides, it's that your visual field switches hemispheres. So whatever is on the right of whatever your point, so imagine that you're staring at something, a point of fixation. Imagine that you're staring away 5-10 feet from your face at a point of fixation. Everything that's to the right of that point of fixation will land in your left hemisphere. Everything that's to the left of that point of fixation will land in your right hemisphere. So your eyeballs do not switch, but half of each eyeball goes to the right hemisphere and half of each eyeball goes to the left hemisphere. So it's a little confusing when you talk about eyeballs. So the way I memorized it was it's not eyeballs, it's visual fields. Everything to the right goes to the left, everything to the left goes to the right. So we've got these left and right hemispheres divided along the longitudinal fissure. We do see sex differences in brain structures, the two hemispheres. Males tend to have a larger left than right hemisphere. On average, the volume is greater on their left hemisphere than on their right hemisphere, whereas females tend to have more symmetry between the two hemispheres. We have this contralateral cortical organization where everything seems to switch, almost everything seems to switch, so that you have these certain, right hand, left hemisphere kinds of effects. Something I wanted to mention in this particular drawing that I forgot to mention is, so looking at the left hemisphere of this brain, see that greenish area on about where the ear would be? It says auditory cortex, right ear. There is an area right above that is in charge of understanding language, and it can be spoken language or it can be something that you're reading. that is processed by this particular part. It's called the Wernicke's area, and we'll talk about that more when we get to language. But I wanted to kind of point it out right here. It's right above that auditory cortex, right above where you might be hearing, but it's only on the left hemisphere in most people. Some people are organized exactly opposite, but in most people, it's in the left hemisphere. And then if you look at the frontal, where it says prefrontal cortex, look right behind that and see that little yellow patch that says speech center? That's the Broca's area that produces speech, that imposes grammar on the fly as you're speaking, selects the vocabulary, and delivers either in writing or in a spoken way. It produces language. And again, only on the left hemisphere of the brain. So we're seeing some asymmetrical factors, right, where some things are on the left and not on the right. We're seeing this contralateral organization. These two hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, which I've circled right there for you. There are a number of other nerve fibers as well, but I want to focus on the corpus callosum because it's the biggest band of fibers that connects the two hemispheres, and its function is strictly to join the two hemispheres so that they can communicate with each other. It's a really tightly bound band of neurons, axons and dendrites that are allowing the neurons on either side of the brain to communicate with each other. And in the olden days of 150, 200 years ago, when they first started dissecting brains, they thought this structure was like just a ligament, right? Just connective tissue that didn't do anything. And it wasn't until maybe 100 years ago that they started figuring out, no, actually, you need this in order to keep your thoughts inside your head and share them between the two hemispheres. If you're going to have those thoughts happening just inside your head, and maybe information has come in through your right visual field and it landed in your left cortex, and you want to tell the right side of your brain about it, that's going to happen across the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is a really important, not just structural component, but actual functional component, because it allows the communication between the hemispheres. There again are sex differences in this. Females tend to have much larger and more densely packed corpus callosa than males do. So interesting sex differences in some brain structures. Now I wanted you to watch this video next, so it's going to be queued up in the playlist where you can watch an example of Michael Gazzaniga, one of the big researchers in split brain research, testing this guy on to show how it looks if you're not able to communicate within your head. So enjoy that video, and I will see you on the other side.